Tokyo, 1944. Rain lashes against the metal roofs of the Naval Technology Institute. Inside a dimly lit laboratory, the smell of oil, ozone, and damp uniforms hangs thick in the air. A group of scientists stands in silence around a heavy, lead-lined table. On it rests a small steel sphere, no bigger than a grapefruit, connected to copper wires and surrounded by radiation shields. The lights flicker as a generator hums in the corner. A young records data, his pen trembling slightly. Outside, sirens wail, another Allied air raid approaching. But no one moves. The men here aren't afraid of bombs tonight. They're afraid of what's in front of them. A messenger bursts in, soaked and breathless, clutching a crumpled document intercepted from Europe. German reports, translated and rushed to Tokyo's high command. One word stands out on the page: uranium. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome lowers his voice, eyes fixed on the paper. If this is true, he says quietly, the Americans may already be building it. No one answers. Only the soft hum of the generator breaks the silence, the sound of humanity standing on the edge of its deadliest creation. By 1944, Japan's war machine was burning through its final reserves of hope. The empire that had once swept across Asia now faced a storm of Allied power from every direction. Factories in Osaka and Yokohama lay in ruins. Fuel convoys were being cut off by American submarines. Every day the sky over Tokyo grew darker, filled with the drone of B-29 bombers. Yet deep within the heart of Japan's military command, another kind of battle was taking shape. One fought not with tanks or planes, but with equations, metal, and the unknown laws of the atom. Japan's fascination with nuclear physics began long before the war. In the 1930s, physicist Yoshio Nishina, a brilliant student of Niels Bohr, had already established Japan's first cyclotron at the Riken Institute. His work was cutting edge, and it placed Japan among the few nations capable of exploring atomic energy at the time. When war broke out, this scientific curiosity turned into something else: desperation. The Japanese Navy, recognizing the growing role of science in warfare, began funding secret military research units. Among them was Project FGO, established to explore whether nuclear fission could produce a weapon powerful enough to change the course of the war. The project was small, scattered across a few laboratories in Tokyo and Kyoto. Its scientists, many of them academics pressed into military service, worked in secrecy, often without understanding the full purpose of their research. They studied uranium compounds, neutron reactions, and chain fission, but faced a constant problem. Japan had no industrial capacity to support the scale such research demanded. Meanwhile, intelligence from Germany hinted at something extraordinary. In 1942, reports reached Tokyo that German scientists under Heisenberg were studying similar reactions, and that the results could lead to a super bomb. Japan's attaches in Berlin sent back technical papers, fragments of data, and verbal briefings, all coded and delivered through diplomatic channels. Admiral Yamamoto, still alive at the time, believed that science would define the next war, not numbers of soldiers or ships. He urged the military to invest in unconventional power, but even he knew Japan's resources were bleeding away too fast. In these years, scientists like Nishina found themselves in moral limbo. On one hand, they were patriots, working to defend their nation from annihilation. On the other, they were physicists, aware that what they were building could destroy civilization itself. The irony was cruel. Japan's physicists were intellectually capable of understanding nuclear fission, yet industrially incapable of realizing it. They lacked uranium ore, heavy water, and large-scale separation plants, things that the United States with its vast resources could produce almost overnight. Still, Tokyo pressed on. FGO scientists began experimenting with uranium oxide, testing neutron reflectors, and sketching early weapon designs. But their laboratories were primitive, their equipment often handmade. Many of their notebooks, later found after the war, were filled with calculations interrupted mid-sentence by bomb alerts. And as the tide of war turned, Japan's scientific dreams began to collide with reality. By early 1944, even senior officers started to question whether the effort was worth it. Every ton of steel, every gram of copper, was being diverted to ships and ammunition. Yet inside the laboratories, the race continued, not for victory anymore, but for fear of being left behind. Because the rumors coming from Germany and Switzerland spoke of something terrifying, that America might already be building a weapon from the same science Japan barely understood. And so, in the final years of the war, Japan's greatest minds toiled in basements and bunkers, chasing an idea they couldn't quite grasp, under skies filled with bombers they couldn't stop. In their silence, a quiet dread began to form, a realization that if such a weapon was possible, and if the Americans succeeded first, it would not just end the war. It would end everything. In the summer of 1944, while Japan's FGO project struggled to acquire even a few kilograms of uranium across the Pacific, the Manhattan Project was becoming the largest scientific operation in human history. In New Mexico, Tennessee, and Washington state, the United States had quietly assembled an army of more than 130,000 workers and scientists. Men like Oppenheimer, Fermi, and Groves commanded resources that dwarfed Japan's entire wartime research budget. Vast plants in Oak Ridge and Hanford consumed the nation's electricity, separating uranium-235 and producing plutonium by the ton. Japan's scientists knew almost nothing of this scale. Their laboratories had no vacuum separators, no graphite reactors, and no sustained neutron sources. Still, the Imperial Command refused to give up. By late 1944, the Japanese Navy had divided its nuclear ambitions into two branches: the Navy-led FGO project in Tokyo and the Army's NIGO project, based at Riken under Nishina's supervision. The rivalry between the two branches was fierce and destructive. Instead of combining efforts, each guarded its data. The Army worked on uranium enrichment using thermal diffusion, while the Navy attempted to explore gaseous methods. Neither side had the necessary industrial infrastructure to make progress. Then came the bombings. Allied air raids grew relentless, targeting research centers and transport networks. Laboratories at Riken were repeatedly hit. One attack destroyed several cyclotron components Nishina's team had spent years assembling. Much of their data was lost in the flames. In desperation, Nishina relocated parts of his team to Konan, in what is now North Korea. The Navy scientists moved south, hiding what little equipment remained in underground tunnels. It was a race against time and against collapse. What haunted them most wasn't failure. It was the creeping realization that somewhere, someone else might already have succeeded. Japanese intelligence officers stationed in Europe began sending increasingly alarming reports. In late 1944, Tokyo received coded information that the Allies were spending billions on a superweapon involving uranium and neutron physics. The details were vague but consistent. Nishina, reading the translated cables, immediately understood the implications. He had calculated the potential energy of nuclear fission himself. If the Americans had the materials and the manpower, the weapon would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. But Japan could no longer keep up. Its merchant fleet was in ruins. Its mines in Southeast Asia were lost. Even acquiring small amounts of uranium oxide had become nearly impossible. Many scientists were drafted into other military roles. Others died in bombings. By early 1945, the once ambitious FGO and NIGO projects had been reduced to fragments. Notes, half-finished instruments, and fading hope. Still, a handful of physicists continued to work in secret. Nishina remained at Riken, measuring the properties of uranium under low-intensity neutron bombardment. He no longer believed Japan could build an atomic bomb, but he feared what would happen when someone else did. Then on August 6, 1945, at precisely 8:15 a.m., a city vanished. From Tokyo, scientists received the first sketchy reports through radio broadcasts. Hiroshima had been wiped out by a single bomb. No one believed it at first. The description was too unreal: one bomb, one city. Even the military doubted it, suspecting exaggeration or mass panic. But within hours, the data began to arrive. Heat, radiation, total destruction within kilometers. When Nishina read the first confirmed U.S. announcement of the atomic bomb, he understood instantly. Everything he had feared for years, Every calculation he'd scribbled under candlelight, every fragment of theory that pointed to the atom's terrible potential, had become real. He is said to have lowered his head and whispered, "They did it." In that moment, the scattered efforts of Japan's scientists, their dreams of national salvation, turned into something darker, a mirror of regret. For in Hiroshima, they saw what their own ambition might have unleashed had history taken another turn. In the quiet corridors of Riken and Kyoto University, the war felt far away. Yet it was everywhere. Young assistants arrived in uniforms, still carrying the smell of gunpowder from air raids. Glass windows were taped in X patterns to prevent shattering. Every day they worked on equations that might save Japan or doom humanity. For men like Yoshio Nishina, the conflict had become deeply personal. He wasn't a soldier, but the nation treated him as one. His weapon was knowledge. His battlefield was the laboratory. He had studied under Bohr, debated with Einstein, and understood the atom in ways few Japanese minds ever had. But as the military tightened control, Nishina's research became a moral trap. He had seen the beauty in nuclear physics, the elegance of nature's smallest forces, and now that beauty was being twisted into a mechanism for annihilation. His letters from the period, though cautious, hinted at internal torment. "To split the atom," he once wrote, "is to split something within ourselves." The younger physicists around him felt the same. Many were idealists, university graduates who joined the war effort out of loyalty, not hatred. They wanted to defend their homeland, not erase cities. But they also feared disobedience. In militarized Japan, questioning orders was dangerous. So they stayed silent, building toward something they didn't fully believe in. In their notebooks, the lines between discovery and destruction blurred, and when Hiroshima was destroyed, silence became guilt. The scientific community, once proud of its pursuit of progress, was confronted with a horrifying truth. They had helped open the door, even if they hadn't walked through it first. Inside Japan's war cabinet, strategy had always been driven by fear of the United States' industrial might. By 1943, Japanese commanders already knew they couldn't win through conventional means. They needed a shock weapon, something that could halt the American advance or force negotiations before invasion. That's where the idea of nuclear research gained traction. The concept of an ultimate bomb fascinated some officers, especially those in the Navy's technical bureaus. Admiral Fukudome and others believed that a single demonstration of superior science could deter the Allies. But the reality was grim. Japan lacked both the materials and the infrastructure to even begin an industrial-scale weapons program. Tactically, Japan's geography worked against it. It had no large uranium mines, no vast desert for testing, and no surplus of scientists to spare. Every air raid crippled its progress. Each destroyed factory meant more months lost. And unlike the Manhattan Project, in which centralized its research under unified command, Japan's approach was divided. The Army and Navy competed, refusing to share information. This rivalry, rooted in decades of bureaucratic tension, proved fatal to efficiency. Some scientists tried to warn the military that an atomic bomb was not a wartime weapon. It was a civilizational one. But no one wanted to hear it. In a war that had already consumed millions of lives, logic had lost its place. Japan's leadership believed that even if an atomic weapon could not be built in time, the research itself might buy psychological leverage, proof that Japan too could stand among the world's scientific powers. That illusion didn't last long. As Allied bombers leveled entire districts in a single night, the idea of an equalizer faded into irrelevance. Science could no longer keep up with destruction. On paper, Japan's nuclear research seemed promising. In reality, it was crippled from the start. To create a bomb, one needed uranium-235, a rare isotope requiring complex separation. The Americans used gas diffusion and electromagnetic methods, powered by enormous plants. Japan had none of that. Its scientists relied on primitive centrifuges and laboratory-scale diffusion columns. They lacked uranium ore, too. Small shipments from conquered territories like Korea and Burma were inconsistent and impure. Without refined materials, every calculation was a guess. Even more limiting was Japan's absence of high-capacity reactors. Nishina's cyclotron, the pride of Riken, could accelerate particles, but it couldn't sustain chain reactions or produce plutonium. By 1944, the Navy's research team at Kyoto had barely managed to detect low-level neutron emissions. The gap between them and Los Alamos wasn't months, it was centuries in industrial terms. Still, Japan's scientists persisted, driven by a mix of duty and fear. Their notebooks contained accurate equations, theoretical weapon yields, and even early sketches of bomb mechanisms. But none of it mattered without the factories, the reactors, and the raw ore that only America possessed. When Allied forces bombed Riken in April 1945, destroying both of its cyclotrons, it symbolized more than a physical loss. It marked the end of Japan's scientific race and the beginning of its reckoning. Because even as the laboratories went silent, the theoretical knowledge remained, and so did the dread of what that knowledge could unleash if perfected elsewhere. And just weeks later, it would be unleashed. In Japan's military hierarchy, the relationship between science and command had always been uneasy. Admirals and generals wanted results, not theories. Yet among a handful of visionaries there was an understanding that the next war would be fought not by numbers of men, but by mastery of energy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been one of those voices. Even before Pearl Harbor, he warned that Japan's victory could never rest on battleships alone. "The future," he once said to his staff, "belongs to those who command the unseen forces." He was speaking of radar, aviation, and, though few understood it, atomic energy. But Yamamoto's death in 1943 left a vacuum. His successors lacked his strategic foresight. What remained were fragmented projects, each backed by competing factions within the Army and Navy. Political ego overshadowed scientific unity. When physicists like Bunsaku Arakatsu and Yoshio Nishina requested more funding and coordination, their reports were often delayed or ignored. To many in command, nuclear research seemed abstract, disconnected from the desperate urgency of defending the homeland. This disconnect proved fatal. The leadership viewed atomic energy as a luxury, not a necessity, until Hiroshima made them realize how wrong they'd been. In later interviews, surviving officers admitted they had underestimated the Americans' capability. One Navy official confessed, "We thought it was a bluff. No one believed a single bomb could destroy a city." It wasn't disbelief born of arrogance, it was disbelief born of experience. To Japan's military mind, destruction had always been measured in tonnage and manpower. The idea that energy itself could erase a city was beyond imagination. But imagination was exactly what the Americans had weaponized. Even before Hiroshima, Japan had been haunted by rumors of Allied superweapons. Radio chatter, diplomatic cables, and German briefings all hinted at something massive underway in the United States. In 1943, Japanese intelligence officers in Berlin gathered fragments of information from their German counterparts. They learned that scientists in America were working under a project codenamed Manhattan. Few details were shared, but the reports mentioned vast industrial plants, heavy security, and unusual shipments of uranium. By 1944, the Navy's intelligence section had compiled a summary for Tokyo's war cabinet. It concluded that the Allies might be pursuing an atomic-type explosive device. But the same report dismissed it as impractical within the duration of this war. That single miscalculation sealed Japan's fate. Even as Japan's own scientists whispered warnings, the intelligence community saw the American effort as propaganda, another attempt to demoralize them. They were wrong. While Tokyo debated, Los Alamos built history's deadliest weapon. After the war, Allied occupation forces interrogated several Japanese physicists. Many revealed that they had indeed suspected what was happening across the Pacific, but lacked proof. One scientist told investigators, "We feared they might already possess it, but there was nothing left to do except wait." And so they waited, until the waiting ended in light. When Hiroshima was hit, those same men gathered in disbelief around radio sets and burned reports. For a moment, even the concept of enemy blurred. They were no longer rivals in war. They were witnesses to a scientific threshold crossed by humanity itself. Long after the surrender, Japanese physicists struggled with the weight of what had happened. Many had spent the war chasing the same principles that created the bomb. None had wanted it to succeed, not even in their own hands. For them, Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't just national tragedies. They were personal reckonings. When the U.S. occupation forces dismantled what remained of Japan's nuclear facilities, Nishina himself oversaw parts of the process. He cooperated fully, handing over equipment, data, and research papers. He didn't resist, because he had seen what resistance to reason had already cost. In interviews years later, his former students described him as quieter after 1945. He still lectured on physics, still guided young scientists, but he avoided speaking about the war. One recalled, "He said science was like a river. It flows whether we want it to or not, but it depends on us whether it floods or gives life." That was the paradox Japan's scientists would live with, that their search for understanding had helped create the means for mass extinction. And yet, there was also something else, a deep sense of responsibility. After the war, many Japanese physicists devoted themselves to peaceful nuclear research, determined that the atom's future should never again serve death. But in 1945, standing among the ruins, that redemption still felt far away. The scientists who once dreamed of saving their nation through knowledge now feared knowledge itself. For they had seen what happens when human curiosity outruns human conscience. And their story, their fear, would only deepen as the reports from Hiroshima became impossible to deny. August 6, 1945. 8:15 Hiroshima time. A blinding flash lit the sky, followed by a silence so deep it seemed to erase the sound of life itself. Within seconds, an entire city disappeared beneath a rising pillar of fire. Hundreds of kilometers away in Tokyo, the news reached the Riken Institute as scattered, confused reports. The initial broadcast was vague. Hiroshima attacked by a new type of bomb. Few believed it. The War Ministry assumed it was conventional bombing. But the wording was strange. "One bomb," the announcer said. One bomb destroyed the city. In his small, cluttered office, Yoshio Nishina read the telegram twice, then stood still for a long time. He had spent years studying nuclear fission, running calculations about the energy released by splitting uranium nuclei. He knew what one bomb, one city meant. He turned to his assistant and spoke quietly. "This is no ordinary weapon." Within hours, more data began to pour in. Eyewitness descriptions of unbearable heat, blinding light, and thousands of people vaporized where they stood. The energy release, the radiation symptoms, the unnatural burns, all of it fit only one conclusion. The Americans had succeeded in building an atomic bomb. For Japan's scientists, it was not just shocking, it was horrifying. They had been trying in their fragmented way to unlock the same power, and now they were watching its result, not in equations but in human bodies. That night, the Navy's EFCO scientists gathered in a small bunker beneath Tokyo. The air smelled of metal and candle smoke. Someone laid out American radio transcripts and weather data from Hiroshima. Nishina spoke first, calm but pale. He explained the blast radius, the radiation sickness, and the likely use of uranium-235. When he finished, the room fell silent. One officer asked, "Could we have done the same if we had more time?" Nishina looked down. "Perhaps, but thank God we did not." The realization spread like shock through the scientific and military communities. The Americans had crossed a boundary no one else had dared to reach. By August 8, Japanese physicists confirmed it conclusively. Hiroshima had been destroyed by nuclear fission. Nishina's group reconstructed the probable weapon yield using surviving data. Their calculation, later compared by Allied scientists, were remarkably accurate. Meanwhile, Tokyo reeled from the psychological impact. Hiroshima was gone. But what terrified the leadership most was uncertainty. How many bombs did the Americans have left? The next day, a new report arrived from Nagasaki. Another bomb. Another city erased. It was no longer a weapon. It was an announcement, the end of Japan's world. Inside Riken, the scientists stopped work. Not by command, but by conscience. The laboratory that once hummed with quiet determination fell into complete stillness. Their calculations now felt obscene. Nishina's assistant later wrote, "We did not speak of our research again. We only waited for what would come next." Across Tokyo, military leaders debated surrender. Some still wanted to fight on, arguing that Japan should resist until the last man. But within the scientific circles, no one doubted what Hiroshima meant. They had witnessed the dawn of a new age, one that made all other weapons meaningless. In those final days, as Japan teetered between denial and collapse, Nishina received an order to visit Hiroshima. He went with a small group of specialists to assess the damage. What they found defied imagination. The city was gone. Shadows burned into stone. Bodies turned to ash where they had stood. Hospitals overflowing with victims who looked uninjured, but were dying slowly from radiation. He didn't take measurements that day. He didn't need to. The site itself was enough. He returned to Tokyo without a word to the press or the military. The next morning, he sent a single-page report to the Navy Command. The weapon used at Hiroshima was atomic in nature. It utilized uranium fission. The energy released exceeds all known explosives. There is no defense. That sentence sealed Japan's scientific realization, and its surrender was now only days away. But for the men who had spent years studying the atom, this was not just the end of a war. It was the end of their innocence. Because the power they once sought to understand had now shown its full face, and it looked like extinction. The following days felt unreal. Japan's leaders were no longer fighting a war. They were negotiating survival. Tokyo was in ruins, communications were fractured, and the emperor himself had begun asking questions no general could answer. Is it true? He reportedly asked his advisors. Has mankind created a bomb like the sun? No one dared reply. Inside the Riken Institute, the scientists who once calculated theoretical yields now sat in silence. Papers that once held equations for weapon design were quietly burned. Even speaking of nuclear research had become unbearable. Yoshio Nishina was summoned again, this time to brief high command on what kind of weapon the Americans had used, and whether Japan could produce one in return. His answer was short, not in this lifetime. That single admission carried the weight of finality. It was the scientific death certificate of Japan's atomic ambitions. By August 12th, the war was functionally over. The U.S. had dropped 2 bombs. The Soviet Union had declared war, and Japan, a nation that once prided itself on scientific progress and discipline, stood at the threshold of total collapse. But within the laboratories, the mood was not fear, it was grief. For years, Japan's physicists had believed that science was neutral, that knowledge itself was beyond morality, yet Hiroshima had proved otherwise. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, 1945, his voice broadcast across the nation. Even the scientists stopped to listen. The tone was calm, resigned. The war situation, he said, has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Then, in veiled reference to the atomic bomb, he added, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. That was the first time the Japanese public heard confirmation. The Americans had used an atomic weapon. Nishina's students later recalled that he stood motionless through the broadcast. When it ended, he quietly removed his glasses, folded them, and said only, "It is over." For him, the surrender wasn't humiliation. It was relief. Relief that the race was done, that no more minds would be consumed by a weapon that turned genius into guilt. After the surrender, Japan's scientific facilities were immediately inspected by American occupation forces. At Riken, U.S. officers from the Manhattan Engineer District found what remained of the NIGO project, destroyed cyclotrons, scattered notes, and fragments of research equipment. The Americans were astonished to learn how far behind Japan had been. They dismantled the machines, cut the cyclotrons into pieces, and dumped the remnants into Tokyo Bay. Nishina watched from a distance. To the Americans, it was a symbolic gesture, the destruction of Japan's nuclear ambitions. To Nishina, it was something deeper, a burial. He never protested. When asked later why he didn't try to preserve the instruments, he simply replied, "They belong to another time." In the weeks following surrender, the surviving scientists were interrogated by Allied investigators. Their testimonies were measured, factual, and tinged with quiet remorse. Many admitted they had known what nuclear fission could unleash, but hoped they would never see it used. Documents recovered later confirmed that both the FGO and NIGO projects had explored the principles of fission weapons. Yet the tone of those reports was more academic than militaristic. They were studies born from curiosity, not bloodlust. Still, curiosity had its cost. The Japanese scientific community, once proud of its independence and precision, now faced an identity crisis. Could science still be pure after Hiroshima? Could intellect exist apart from morality? For Nishina, the answer was no. In the months after the war, he turned his attention to medicine, helping to study radiation's effects on survivors. It was his way of making amends, of transforming destructive knowledge into healing. One of his students years later described him as a man haunted by equations. He still solved them, but he did so with the knowledge that every number could represent lives, not just particles. And though Japan's laboratories would later rise again, they would do so under a new philosophy, that science, unchecked by conscience, leads only to ruin. The atomic age had begun, and Japan had seen its birth not through victory but through devastation. In the ashes of Hiroshima, every nation glimpsed the same truth Japan's scientists already knew, that once humanity unlocked the atom, it could never unlearn it. And that realization marked not just the end of a war, but the beginning of mankind's greatest fear. The war was over, but Japan's cities looked like the surface of another planet. From the industrial ruins of Tokyo to the ghostly silence of Hiroshima, everything bore the mark of fire and fallout. What had begun as an empire of ambition now existed as rubble and shadow. In the weeks following the surrender, Allied occupation forces arrived, not as invaders but as witnesses to devastation. Their task was to rebuild, document, and in many ways to study. For the first time, the world could see the human consequences of nuclear power. American teams entered Hiroshima and Nagasaki, armed with Geiger counters, film cameras, and notebooks. What they found stunned even seasoned military men. The cities weren't just destroyed, they were erased. Buildings had vaporized, shadows were burned onto walls, iron beams had twisted like paper. And yet, amid this silence, something else stirred, an urgent scientific curiosity. Doctors and physicists from both nations began recording the effects of radiation on the human body. Victims with burns that wouldn't heal, hair falling out in clumps, organs failing without visible injury. It was science written in human suffering. Back in Tokyo, Yoshio Nishina was summoned again, this time not by generals but by Allied scientists from the Manhattan Engineer District. They wanted to know exactly what Japan had been building. Nishina cooperated fully. He handed over reports, calculations, and his remaining research logs. His transparency surprised the Americans. Unlike the Nazi nuclear scientist who had hidden or destroyed evidence, Nishina seemed almost relieved to let it all go. "I am glad," he told them, "that we never succeeded." Those words would echo through Japan's academic circles for decades. To many, they symbolized the country's scientific conscience, a quiet acknowledgement that failure had saved them from moral ruin. Meanwhile, U.S. officials compiled their findings into classified reports. The conclusion was simple. Japan had neither the resources nor the time to build a functioning bomb. Their uranium was too scarce, their cyclotrons too weak, their scientists too isolated from one another to cooperate effectively under wartime secrecy. But that assessment also revealed something else: how close the world had come to a future where multiple nations raced toward atomic power without restraint. The Manhattan Project had ended that race violently, but it had not erased the desire. Within a year, the Soviet Union began its own program. Britain followed. France, China, and others joined the line. What began in secret labs in Los Alamos and Riken had become a global contagion, the pursuit of ultimate destruction. In Japan, the Riken Institute was allowed to continue research, but under strict oversight. Many of its facilities were dismantled or repurposed for peaceful science. Nishina and his colleagues pivoted to radiation medicine, particle physics, and education. Their goal now was to teach, not to weaponize. Yet even as Japan rebuilt its cities and its dignity, the ghosts of August 1945 never left. Survivors of the Hibakusha carried the marks of atomic fire in their bodies. Children were born sick. Families lived with stigma and silence. And for many scientists, those survivors became the only justification for continuing research, to understand, to prevent, to heal. In 1946, when American forces returned Nishina's confiscated cyclotrons, or what was left of them, he declined to rebuild them. He preferred to focus on what he called the science of peace. When asked years later what that meant, he replied, "The science that asks not what can be done, but what should be done." It was a quiet philosophy born from catastrophe, and one that would shape Japan's post-war scientific identity for generations. The same men who once dreamed of splitting atoms for the empire now taught their students the cost of knowledge without ethics. And though Hiroshima's scars remained visible, Japan's scientists began their slow transformation, from makers of war to guardians of peace. But the world outside Japan wasn't done with the bomb. While Tokyo sought peace, Washington and Moscow prepared for another kind of war, one that would turn fear itself into strategy. And from the ruins of one nation's defeat, a new era was taking shape, the age of deterrence. By 1947, the war's dust had settled, but its shadow had only grown longer. The atomic bomb was no longer just a weapon. It was a currency of power. Nations measured strength not by armies or fleets, but by how close they stood to the nuclear threshold. In Washington, U.S. scientists raced to refine their weapon into something smaller, deadlier, and easier to deliver. In Moscow, Soviet physicists, with help from captured German data, worked day and night to close the gap. The arms race had begun. Japan, meanwhile, stood in an entirely different silence. Its constitution, rewritten under American occupation, included a clause that renounced war altogether. Article 9 forbade the nation from maintaining military forces for aggression. But beneath that political restraint lay a deeper moral one, an awareness born from first-hand experience of what atomic power could do. For Japanese scientists, that awareness became a burden and a mission. They were among the first to understand that nuclear science could never again be neutral. The same knowledge that lit cities could also erase them. In 1949, Nishina helped establish Japan's first post-war research programs focused on nuclear energy, not weapons, but power generation. He envisioned a future where atomic science would restore rather than destroy. But even as he lectured about peace, he carried the memories of the war with him. He died in 1951 quietly, leaving behind pages of equations and a message to his students. Never forget the weight of the atom. Those words became a quiet creed for Japan's scientific community. When, years later, the government began exploring civilian nuclear power, many older physicists resisted. They remembered the fever of 1943, when equations had been used as weapons. They remembered the silence after Hiroshima, when intellect met its own consequence. But the rest of the world had no such restraint. The 1950s saw the testing of hydrogen bombs, weapons 1,000 times more powerful than those that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The sky above the Pacific turned white from artificial suns, and fallout drifted across oceans. Japan could not escape it. In 1954, the crew of the fishing boat Daigo Fukuryu Maru, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was caught in the radioactive cloud from a U.S. hydrogen bomb test at Bikini Atoll. They suffered severe radiation sickness. One crewman died. The incident reignited Japan's trauma and sparked global outrage. Once again, Japanese scientists found themselves at the center of a moral storm, studying radiation not as weapon designers, but as witnesses. From that moment on, Japan's public stance hardened. Nuclear power could be studied, but never militarized. The story of Japan's wartime nuclear ambitions faded into archives, overshadowed by the American and Soviet arms race. Yet within universities and research institutes, the memory persisted, whispered between generations of scientists who remembered what it felt like to chase knowledge for the wrong reasons. In 1967, Japan formally declared its 3 non-nuclear principles: not to possess nuclear weapons, not to produce them, not to permit their introduction into Japanese territory. It was a policy born not of politics but of history, a moral reaction to the lessons burned into Hiroshima's ground. Decades later, declassified American intelligence confirmed what many already knew. Japan's wartime atomic research had never come close to a functioning bomb. But that didn't matter. The emotional cost, the fear, the regret, the realization of what might have been, had already changed the nation forever. In a world that still built nuclear arsenals by the hundreds, Japan became the only country to live both sides of the atomic story, the maker that failed and the victim that survived. By the time the Cold War settled into uneasy balance, Japan's laboratories were leading the world in peaceful nuclear science. Their reactors powered cities. Their physicists studied cosmic rays, not weapons. Yet every breakthrough carried the echo of 1945, a silent reminder that brilliance without conscience can light the sky only once. From the ashes of Hiroshima rose not just reconstruction, but responsibility. A sense of duty that knowledge must serve life, not death. And for the scientists who once feared their own invention, that was the truest form of redemption. History often measures power in victories, but the story of Japan's atomic scientists reminds us that power can also lie in restraint. When Yoshio Nishina and his team began their experiments, they believed they were serving science, perhaps even their nation's survival. But by the end of the war, they understood something few ever do, that there are discoveries too heavy for the human conscience to bear. The bomb changed everything. It redrew the boundaries between genius and guilt, between curiosity and consequence. The world entered an age where a single equation could decide the fate of millions. Japan stood at the center of that moral earthquake. The same nation that once pursued atomic knowledge as a weapon became the only one to feel its full cost. And in that suffering, something transformed, not just in its politics or its cities, but in its spirit. For the scientists who survived, the lesson was clear. Intelligence alone isn't wisdom. Progress without morality is just a more efficient path to ruin. That understanding shaped Japan's post-war identity. It became a country that prized technology, but feared its misuse, a place where research was bound by ethics and innovation was shadowed by remembrance. Every year when the bells ring in Hiroshima, they don't just mourn the dead. They remind the living that knowledge has a duty, that science, for all its brilliance, must remain humble before the lives it can alter. The men who once worked to unleash the atom spent the rest of their lives trying to understand it, not as a weapon, but as a warning. Their story isn't one of failure, but of awakening, because on the day Japanese scientists feared humanity's deadliest invention, they didn't just witness the power of destruction. They glimpsed the boundary of what it means to be human, and the cost of crossing it. Fade to black. The echo of Hiroshima lingers,